Hi everyone. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. We're gliding quietly through the spice-scented corridors of history, in silk slippers no less, to discover how one humble little mineral, salt, turned entire civilizations into savvy, salty entrepreneurs. You might know it today as the thing you accidentally pour too much of onto your fries, or the reason your kitchen gets suspiciously steamy after a midnight ramen raid. But long ago, salt wasn't just a seasoning. It was a paycheck, a power play, and occasionally the cause of ancient drama more intense than a season finale. Oh, and before your eyelids press themselves like well-folded laundry, don't forget to press that like button. You know, for historical accuracy. Now let's dim the lights of your mind and sail back, way back, to a world lit by oil lamps and ruled by salty ambition. Picture this. You're in ancient Mesopotamia, a place with so many ziggurats, you'd swear early architects had a pyramid problem. It's around 2400 BCE. The clay tablets are still drying in the sun, and the world's first accountants are carefully tracking goats, beer, and yes, salt. Not because anyone thought it made soup taste better, though it did, but because in cities like Ur and Babylon, salt was so valuable, it was used to pay wages. That's right. People walked home from work holding a fistful of salt, muttering, "Another day, another brine." These early civilizations knew how to stretch their seasoning. Salt preserved fish, powered pickles, and most critically, kept meat from turning into a prehistoric health hazard. When your refrigerator was still a few millennia away from being invented, a good sprinkle of salt could feel as life-changing as inventing sliced bread, which also hadn't been invented yet. But salt wasn't just practical, it was political. Fast forward, or rather dreamily drift, a little westward to ancient Egypt. Pharaohs loved salt. They didn't just dab it on their lentils, they mummified people with it. That's right. The same thing you toss on popcorn was used to dry out pharaohs, so successfully, we're still creeping them out in museums today. If embalming had an all-star quarterback, it was natron, a salty compound made of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate, essentially spa salts with a more eternal purpose. In Egypt, salt was mined and traded like gold. That's because it was gold, white gold to be exact. Merchant ships gracefully glided down the Nile, glinting in the sun, their hulls full not of incense or silk, but of tastefully piled heaps of sparkly salt. It was stored in amphorae and traded from temple to temple, city-state to city-state, like divine seasoning. It helped build temples, fund wars, and bribe more than a few high priests with a taste for the finer things. Salt caravans became a familiar sight in the ancient world. Slow, sun-bleached, and sandwiched between whispers of spice and sweat, these caravans moved across deserts like floating mirages. The camels, ever dignified, perhaps grumbled at their lot in life, but they carried salt across the vast Sahara, linking sub-Saharan Africa to the coastal cities of the Mediterranean, like tiny ships sailing on golden waves of sand. And this, dear sleeper, brings us quietly to a moment that's as soft as a linen robe in the Aegean breeze. In early Greece, the words for salary and salt had more than a passing resemblance. The Latin noun sol gave us salarium, a salt allowance paid to Roman soldiers. Imagine a brave centurion surviving a skirmish, brushing off his tunic and saying to his commander, "By Zeus, where's my sodium stipend?" This is not a joke of modern imagination. It's the root of your pay stub. Your boring old salary, that dependable line in your checking account, was born from the salt that crossed borders, filled amphorae, and kept fish suspiciously fresh for unacceptable amounts of time. Isn't it poetic? The thing that now crossed the rim of a margarita glass once funded epic conquests and sacred rituals. Salt, it's more than a seasoning. It's a subtle monument to human endurance, ingenuity, and absolutely feral economic bartering. So the next time you shake some on your eggs, pause just a moment and whisper, "Thanks, Babylon." As the candlelight of your imagination flickers low, let us trail onward gently to where roads were built, not just for glory and conquest, but for the smooth, granular journey of salt, and secrets folded gently into stone. Chapter 2. The Salty Streets of Sumer. Let us drift gently back, through layers of sand and silence, to a place where rivers dreamed in crescents and clay tablets whispered news of yam harvests and minor bureaucratic scandals. We are in Sumer now. Yes, that Sumer. The glittering cradle of civilization, provided your definition of glittering, allows for goats, mud bricks, and the occasional flood. Sumer, nestled snugly between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq, was the ancient world's buzzing metropolis. If buzzing counted as two men arguing over barley prices and a priestess smudging cuneiform receipts in the temple archives with her elbow. But look closer, past the ziggurats resting under a sleepy sun, past the wandering oxen and startled scribes, and you may notice something faintly shimmering in the air, that quiet, glimmering mineral, the real business behind all the clamour. Salt. Ah yes, salt. In Sumer, salt was not just a seasoning, though we're confident someone tried sprinkling it on barley muffins. It was a sign of divine favour. It preserved the meat between sacrifices, made food tolerable on a good day, and most importantly, served as a medium of exchange long before coinage took its shiny place in our collective purse. While the modern West destroys friendships over monopoly games, ancient Sumerians were conducting salt-based deals with the serene focus of true professionals. One labourer might be paid in a measure of salt for clearing irrigation canals, while a particularly charming fisherman might offer a tray of river-caught delicacies, plus a pinch of the good stuff in exchange for a new fishing net. Salt was a subtle but potent stand-in for currency, quietly slipping through markets, temples, and kitchen hearths with the ambition of a young merchant and the dignity of a high priest's robe. And it wasn't just economic. No, in Sumer, salt had flair. Salt laced through their spiritual rituals like a silvery thread. The word for salt in Sumerian, shad, appears carved into tablets as early as 2500 BCE, often in rituals where purifying spaces, or say, exorcising a particularly grouchy goat spirit, was required. Sprinkle salt at the door, chant something ominous about 7 winds, and presto, demon-free dwelling. Just add water and incense. Imagine, if you will, a Sumerian tax official, sandals neatly arranged, beard braided with precision, leaning over a clay tablet to count baskets of wheat, jars of beer, and perhaps a little box of salt, smiled at with reverence. A wise investment, he might think. Lasts longer than milk and can ward off the evil eye. Better than goatskin bonds, frankly. Their markets, bustling yet polite, pulsed with the subtle essence of saline commerce. Though the primary currencies enumerated in cuneiform ledgers were typically barley, silver, and perhaps sheep, negotiable, salt retained its quiet allure. It was transportable, vital, and always welcomed. Once you've had salted lentils, there's no turning back. Even foreign traders, those daring wanderers from the Zagros Mountains or the rolling plains beyond Elam, brought salt along with wool and copper. knowing full well its value in Suma's humid lands, where storage and preservation were lifelong Olympic events. Salt pressed itself into diplomacy, sticking to treaty clauses and wedding ceremonies like a guest who always brings gifts no one dares refuse. And perhaps most charmingly, in a city where law codes were punishable and clay was as common as gossip, the people of Suma understood that sometimes, when your sheep are misbehaving and your harvest is late, what you really need is just a little more salt. So as the slow moon begins to rise over the mud brick rooftops, casting soft silver across canals and courtyards, let us tip our woven caps to the quiet granules that flavored a civilization. They may not have jingled like coins or sparkled like gemstones, but they stitch themselves into the fabric of daily life with gentle, essential persistence. Now, as we leave behind the gentle murmurs of Suma, past temple grounds and sleepy cattle yawning under fig trees, let us follow the salt trail westward, toward a land of pyramids and sun-born rituals, where salt met royalty and sand formed borders of gold. Chapter 3. The Salt Roads and the Slow Walk of Camels. Let's drift, softly now, across a landscape where the sand ponders the wind and history moves as slowly as a camel caravan plodding toward the horizon. Imagine, if you will, a sky so wide it yawns, stretching out above vast stretches of sunlit dust. We are somewhere between now and ancient always, traipsing gently over the salt roads of the Sahara, winding paths carved not by armies, but by the whispering necessity of salt. Yes, the desert housed no great rivers, no leafy groves of olives or grapes, but it had salt, glorious white chunks of it, gleaming like fallen stars trapped in the sand. And where there's salt, there's someone willing to put on too many layers of wool and walk 10 days past the limits of sanity to sell it. Our gentle guides on this journey, camels, specifically the one-humped dromedaries, who always look a bit like they're storing secrets in their necks. Perhaps they are. Desert traders called them the ships of the desert, and while ships might cut through waves, these creatures shuffled through dunes with a dignified slowness, carrying slabs of salt the size of stubborn bread loaves. Picture this. A caravan would set out from Tagaza, a forgotten mining town in what is now Mali, with salt mined from the skeleton of a dried-up ancient sea. Workers used their bare hands and basic tools to chisel blocks from the earth, then stacked them like sleepy dominoes on camels, each animal bearing over 200 pounds of crunchy treasure, and you thought your suitcase was heavy. For weeks, they crept along treacherous routes punctuated by dunes the size of dreams and the occasional oasis, where palms leaned in like gossiping aunts, offering dates and warm water to weary travelers and their beasts. The trade routes weren't just about survival. They linked civilizations. North met south. Arabs met Berbers, met black African traders. Tuaregs wrapped in indigo and mystery navigated these roads by starlight, using their memories and the desert's own subtle hints, rock pattern here, wind direction there, to find the way back and forth. No maps, just timeless grit and a few poetic yawns. And what did they get in return for all this effort and very sandy laundry? Gold. You see, some parts of Africa had more gold than caution, but lacked salt. In places like the ancient empire of Ghana, not the modern country, but its distant ancestor, salt was so precious that it was traded ounce for ounce with gold. Imagine a currency so potent that a block of it could buy you a feast, a camel, or, in rough patches of history, your freedom. And thus salt built bridges, not stone ones perhaps, but bridges of understanding, connection, and uncomfortable travel. A salted camel train was the glue sticking together kingdoms. It was linked in for empires. Before emails and conference calls, there were salted slabs and dusty trudges. This, dear listener, was the desert's quiet economy, soft and slow, but steady. Now, in a move that feels almost ironic, the thing that spoiled food was also the very thing that preserved power. Kings hoarded salt. Traders ricocheted across brutal landscapes for it. Entire cities swelled with prosperity because of its trade. Timbuktu, that shimmering dot at the edge of every Atlas joke, thrived because camels clomped in with salt and clomped out with stories, gold, and desperate sunburns. We don't often associate economic brilliance with people who go weeks without sitting in a chair. But here they were, paddling through powdered earth, reshaping economies one hoofbeat at a time. And gently now, let us not forget the salt itself, not the shaker on your table, but the kind cut from ancient crusts and handled like relics. In the crusty white plains, traders revered these blocks. They were sacred, weighty, and vital. More than just seasoning, they were survival with edges. Even now, parts of this ancient trading route are walked somewhat by descendants of those early salt barons. The roads remain invisible on most maps, but in the minds of camel men, passed down in lullabies stitched with wind. As the sun sets slowly over a Sahara painted in hues of peach and rust, the caravan halts. The camels kneel with the grace of sleeping prophets. The traders begin their fires, heating water that smells faintly of dust and ancient ambition. And so, we too pause. For ahead lies a tale, a moment in time when salt didn't just move across deserts, but into the very veins of cities, temples, and empires. But hush now, we'll wander there soon, with quiet footsteps and salted dreams. Chapter 4. Of Camels, Caravanserais, and Crystalline Riches. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a long, undulating line of camels, gently swaying side to side like ships at sea. If the sea were made of dust, and the sails were furry, and all the ships could spit at you. These camels are journeying across the Sahara, their padded feet pressing softly into the golden sand, guided by stars, survival instincts, and a disapproval of harsh schedules. This, right here in the soft belly of the desert, is where salt becomes serious business. Long before convenience stores or contactless payment, traders loaded bricks of salt onto the backs of camels and headed to market as if they carried bars of gold. And in their world, they pretty much did. One might say salt was the cryptocurrency of the ancient world. If it weren't for the fact that salt could not crash due to a tweet, or require mining that involved graphics cards and parental disappointment. Rather, salt mining was a more literal affair. In the ancient city of Tagaza, deep in the Western Sahara, folks mined sparkling slabs of salt from underground seabeds, long swallowed by time. It was not a place for dreamers, really, unless your dreams involve sunburn, 2 toothbrushes of drinking water a day, and nothing but salt as far as the eye could sting. Tagaza, entire buildings were constructed with salt bricks. The walls, salt. The mosques, salt. The cupboard where they may or may not have kept sugar, also salt. Even their cooking involved a delicate pinch of architectural material. Now, once these treasured crystalline slabs, called amole and weighing just shy of a sleepy camel nap, were secured, caravans set off through the desert. This was not the kind of road trip requiring playlists or snack breaks. Though let's be honest, someone probably insisted on bringing dates and camel jerky. And overnight, salt caravans became spine-tingling networks of trade that connected North Africa to sub-Saharan empires. Yes, indeed, empires that rose and fell, glittered and faded, all in salty synchrony. One of the rock stars of this era, if rock stars were contemplative sandal-wearing monarchs, was Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali in the 14th century. You may have heard a whisper about his pilgrimage to Mecca, during which he reportedly gave away so much gold it distorted entire economies, like a well-meaning uncle who brings too many cookies to the bake sale. But what oiled the gears of his mighty empire? Spoiler, it was the salty bricks riding along with the golden ones. The mighty city of Timbuktu wasn't just a name on an antique map rolled up in your great-uncle's attic. Oh no, Timbuktu was a hub of learning, faith, poetry, astronomy, and yes, salt. It was a place where dried fish and slabs of sodium chloride commingled with scholars and manuscripts. Salt in this world was more than seasoning. It was scholarship, sustenance, and the finest medium of human connection that didn't require a pigeon or parchment. At cozy way stations known as caravanserais, travelers rested and shared news, stories, and probably a few grumbles about camel blisters. Mud walls radiated daytime heat into the cool of night as traders drifted into sleep, nestled beside bundles of salt. Some kept their souls so close, one could almost imagine them sighing the words, "Good night, sweet grain." In certain West African cultures, salt was held so dear that it was exchanged weight for weight with gold. That's right, gold and salt, cozying up to one another like star-crossed lovers with entirely different melting points. Imagine bartering a lump of salt for a pouch of gold dust. It feels mad now, doesn't it? But pause and think how often gold helped someone survive hunger, while salt quite literally preserved entire societies. A pinch of salt cured meat for months of travel, fended off dehydration, and brightened dull dishes long before bouillon cubes dreamed of existing. And so, as night ripples across our dreamy desert and the caravan winds on beneath the velvet sky, the soft crunch of camel footsteps trailing behind, we leave this part of our salty history feeling ever so slightly brined with wonder. Ahead still lies salt's quiet siege into castles, kitchens, and conspiracies. But the fire is low, and the stars are blinking extra slowly tonight. Let's drift onward, shall we? Chapter 5. The Salty Roads of Rome. While the night hums quietly outside your window and your pillow welcomes your weary head, let us wander gently into the sandals of a Roman citizen, perhaps one with a particularly well-seasoned toga. Tonight, we take a stroll down one of the oldest highways of the Roman Republic, a road so important it practically shimmers with significance and sodium. It's called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, and it's not nearly as crunchy as the name suggests. Long before the Romans were building aqueducts taller than your local shopping mall and inventing toilets complicated enough to need their own instruction scrolls, they were focused on something far older, far more essential, the movement of salt. You see, Rome wasn't built in a day, but if it had been, it would have been sprinkled generously. The Via Salaria wasn't a place for scenic Sunday walks, although the rolling hills around it were quite pleasant, if you didn't mind the occasional Gaul raid. No, this road was business, salt business. It snaked across central Italy, from the shimmering Adriatic Sea to Rome itself, flanked by merchants, mules, and the occasional over-ambitious philosopher trying to sell pickled olives with deep existential questions on the side. The Sabines, a mountain people with excellent beards and even better preservation skills, were among the first to transport salt along this path. Now, here's a fun little bedtime whisper. The Sabines are actually considered co-founders of Rome, after a dramatic period historians call The kings were probably making most of this up. According to legend, the Romans loved their salty neighbors. Well, right after the whole kidnapping their women incident. But that's a bedtime story for troubled children, not those seeking sweet dreams and mineral-based economies. Back to our peaceful salt road, the Via Salaria became more than a passage for seasoning. It was a symbol of nourishment, preservation, and payment. Yes, payment. The Roman word salarium comes from sal, meaning, you guessed it, salt. Roman soldiers sometimes received part of their wages in salt or money to buy salt, giving birth to the word salary. Next time you look longingly at your paycheck, imagine it crumbling gently into a pile of white crystals, useful for both flavoring lentils and confirming your place in the empire's food chain. Even the Roman military, precise and prouder than a peacock in polished armor, relied heavily on salt, not just for preserving meat on campaign, but for morale. Hungry soldiers marching from Gaul to Germania weren't about to attack a barbarian horde on an empty stomach. Apply enough salt, and suddenly, goat jerky could taste like hope. Now picture this: a caravan rumbling softly through the early morning mist on the Via Salaria. Mules clip-clop in rhythm, carts creak with the weight of white gold. The mule driver hums a tune, maybe something rhythmic, almost a lullaby in Latin. The guard at the rear is half awake, dreaming of a warm stew and possibly a promotion. Along this path, salt didn't just travel, it transformed. It turned bland broths into comfort food. It elevated sheep farmers into merchants. It brought communities together and sometimes tore them apart when prices spiked. At markets and forums, deals were struck with oily handshakes over jars of garum, that famously fishy Roman sauce that, once smelled, was never forgotten or forgiven. And so, the Via Salaria stands, even now, dusty and quiet beneath modern wheels and sneakered tourists who have no idea they're pacing over ancient logistics genius. The stones beneath once bore the weight of salt so vital, it became currency. So desired, it shaped routes and rituals. So simple, it built empires. As twilight softens the arches of Rome and the roads rest under sleeping stars, we, too, shall let the salt road dim in our minds. Another step taken in our gentle journey through history's quiet corners, where even roads had flavor. As for what lies just beyond the edge of that salty stone path, we'll drift there next, like a spice-laden breeze from the Mediterranean. Let your eyes grow heavy and let the mules carry us forward in dreams. Chapter 6: The Roman Empire's Salty Road to Riches. Nestle in, dear dreamer, and smooth out your toga, whether it's made of linen or just a particularly soft blanket, as we drift now to the vast, sun-drenched expanse of the Roman Empire. Yes, the Romans, the sandal-clad civil engineers, philosophers, and part-time emperors with trust issues. But among their many obsessions, conquest, public baths, and overly dramatic death scenes, was something far humbler and much tastier: salt. Now, if you think the average Roman ate a little too much anchovy paste and shouted, "Et tu, brute," over dinner, you're not terribly far off. But it's not just their curious cuisine that revolved around salt. In many ways, Roman civilization was paved, quite literally and bureaucratically, with the stuff. Let's take a gentle stroll down the Via Salaria, shall we? Ah, yes, a name that rolls off the tongue like olive oil down a marble bust. The Via Salaria, or the Salt Road, was an ancient Roman highway before highways were cool. It wound its stony way from the salt pans on the Adriatic Sea all the way toward Rome. Not a vacation route, mind you. This road had one job: to move salt. That's right. Rome literally built roads for salt. Not gold, not silk, not even wine. Salt. Salt wasn't just for flavor. It was essential for food preservation, particularly when refrigeration involved something more along the lines of a clay pot and crossed fingers. Fish, meat, olives, practically anything the Roman palate adored, was packed and preserved in layers of precious salt. Without it, every Roman banquet would have smelled worryingly like the inside of an amphora in the summertime. And trust me, no empire is built on sandwich spoilage. Now here's a cozy trivia nugget. Did you know that some historians believe Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt? The Latin word salarium is where we get our modern salary. Picture a centurion grumbling that his salt wage won't last the week, thanks to those new salty taxes and increased sponge costs. Everything costs a denarius and a half these days, he might mutter as he eyes his crumbling pot of garum fish sauce. Of course, the entire Roman system was bubbling with salt-based logic. Take the word soldier in the Roman world. It wasn't just someone with a sword and an unusually short skirt. It was someone who was valuable enough to be bought, maintained, and fed in salt. A human being whose worth could literally be measured in granules. And you thought modern HR spreadsheets were strange. Even Roman religion had its seasoning. Salt was considered pure, sacred even. During certain ceremonies, it was offered to the gods alongside grain. Not a grand gesture, perhaps, but an offering that said, "We're frugal, but we care." A kind of ancient Roman equivalent of gifting a scented candle and hoping it passes as thoughtful. And then there's Pliny the Elder, our favorite ancient know-it-all, and Rome's original enthusiastic oversharer. He wrote extensively and somewhat dramatically about salt in his Natural History. According to Pliny, nothing is more useful than salt and sunshine, which frankly sounds like something your cousin Cecilia says while crocheting in the garden. Still, Pliny was onto something. Salt was the sunshine of the Roman pantry, preserving, purifying, and perhaps most importantly, organizing. A crystal empire made orderly through saliferous logistics and salty ambition. Even the phrase "worth one's salt" likely originates from this era, whispering echoes of time when to be valuable meant keeping things unspoiled, and perhaps slightly thirst-inducing. So as you pad through the cool marble halls of your imagination this evening, know that beneath the chariots, gladiators, and suspiciously waxed senators lay the humble gleaming powder that kept Rome ticking. It wasn't spectacle or steel that held the empire together. It was a flavor, a mineral, a preservative legacy so potent it lingers in your pretzels to this day. And as night deepens across the 7 hills of memory, our sandals still crunch gently on the Via Salaria. Beyond this road, there's a world of spices still waiting to awaken. But for now, let's rest beneath the Roman stars, salt-kissed, stone-silent, and still. Tomorrow we'll drift toward Egypt, where salt will whisper secrets from under golden sands. Chapter 7: Cleopatra's Salted Secrets and the Spa-Loving Ancients. Let us drift now to a palace where the marble is cool and bare feet, and the scent of crushed rose petals hangs thick in the summer air. Welcome to ancient Egypt, my sleepy traveller, where even queens understood the true currency of glow: salt. To many, Cleopatra is remembered for her eyeliner and famous flings. But behind the smoky coal and boat rides with Mark Antony, she was, in fact, a savvy wellness guru centuries before the first luxury spa existed. And what was her secret ingredient to eternal radiance and political power? Not diamonds, not dragon's blood. Salt. Now, put away notions of table salt shakers or crinkly fast food packets. Cleopatra dealt in the sophisticated side of sodium chloride, soothing Dead Sea salt, dense with minerals and gossip-worthy in royal court circles. The Dead Sea, despite its dramatic name and poor hospitality to fish, has long been the world's saltiest spa. In fact, its shores are almost 9 times saltier than ocean water, boasting a briny richness that soothed everything from aches to awkward first date muscle tension. The ancient Egyptians weren't just popping salt into their baths for beauty. Oh no. They knew salt as sacred. It preserved their fish, their meat, their bodies. Yes, even in death. Salt, specifically natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, bicarbonate, and a dash of desert flair, was their go-to for mummification. If the body was a house for the soul, salt was the locksmith who kept the door from getting stinky. You see, to become eternal, the body had to be dry, like desert dry, and nothing dries quite like salt. It was the original no expiration date pantry item for eternal life management. Priests who specialized in the funeral arts handled their natron like the finest gold. It was measured, blessed, and packed with as much reverence as a royal offering. And here's the twisty turn bit. Salt wasn't just for drying the nobles. Everyday folks, if properly connected or appropriately salted, could receive modest mummification plans. Meanwhile, Queen Cleopatra, cleverer than a cat in the sun, understood that matters of salt weren't just to be locked in tombs or hidden in priestly temples. She infused it into her daily rituals. Her baths, laced with minerals from the Dead Sea, were so acclaimed that Roman nobility later imported similar salts to recreate the experience at home. In fact, Mark Antony once gifted her the rights to these mystical salt-rich shores, a romantic gesture in that very Roman way of sealing a flirtation with a land deal. Now rest easy, knowing this. Cleopatra's skincare regimen might very well have funded itself via trade agreements involving salt extraction. Yes, salt transactions were not just about survival, they were about sovereignty. The Egyptians taxed salt, controlled salt production, and even paid workers, including pyramid builders, at least in part with salt rations. Imagine spending your day tugging limestone up a sun-blasted ramp, all for your daily pinch of paycheck salt. As night deepens around us, the Nile flows on quietly. Its waters once ferried heavy barges of salt, drifting past palm-fringed villages where children played beside storage jars ticking with crystal treasures. Even the word salary whispers of these salted origins. From ancient Latin salarium, a payment made to Roman soldiers to buy their salt, it's clear that salt greased the gears of armies as well as faces. And long before influencers hawked serums and shimmery moisturizers with made-up ingredients, Cleopatra and her desert chemists knew that salt, real, crusty, mineral-profound salt, was the ticket to both beauty and empire. So, as the Egyptian stars blink silently above the Valley of the Kings, and the desert cools under its silk dark cloak, imagine ancient hands sprinkling salt not just on wounds or on food, but on fate. Tonight, let your mind float like a papyrus skiff on the calmest part of the Nile, where salt once mingled with sunlight at the water's edge. And if ever your dreams need restoring, just add a little salt. In the upcoming chapter, we will travel across shifting sand dunes and ancient trade routes, where the salt trails were not only maps but lifelines. Chapter 8: The Wanderings of Salty Soldiers and the March of the Mile Eaters. Drift with me now, softly, sleepily, into the dust-smudged roads of ancient Rome, where Caligay, The hobnailed sandals of the Roman legions crunch rhythmically across Europe's ever-expanding map. They're not marching atop treasure chests or hauling bags of gold behind them. No, their most prized payment is lighter than a coin, crisper than a scroll, and wonderfully simple. Salt. Yes, our old friend makes a regal return here, for in the disciplined world of Roman logistics, salt didn't shimmer in spice cabinets. It shimmered on pay slips and the sweat of long marches. Picture tens of thousands of tireless troops, each with a gladius in hand and a determined gleam in their eye, mostly thanks to being paid to care. And they were paid, at least in part, with salt, or an allowance called a salarium. Ever heard of a salary? That's salt's little linguistic legacy, a tribute from the heart of empire to your paycheck. Roman soldiers, known for their love of roads, conquest, and surprisingly detailed paperwork, needed a portable, practical way to preserve their food and dignity. Salt was both. With it, a legionary could cure his pork, pickle his vegetables, fend off bacteria, and, if feeling particularly bold, barter for better wine at camp. Not only was salt a form of currency, it was a strategic asset. Wherever the Romans marched, they established viae salariae, salt roads spiraling through terrains from Gaul to the Middle East. Entire supply lines were built with the clarity of a recipe. Step 1, add salt. Step 2, add soldiers. Step 3, stir vigorously into the borders of Germania. Some of these roads, like the Via Salaria itself, were named, quite literally, the Salt Way, so there's really no mistaking what it was for. It stretched from the shimmering salt flats at the mouth of the Tiber up into the Sabine hills, moving that valuable white gold from coast to conquest, and where salt moved, Romans followed. Now, here's where things take a wonderfully dreamy twist. Imagine a wool-cloaked Roman quartermaster, eyes narrowed in calculation, trying to ration out salt blocks in a rainy Britannic outpost. He coughs, mutters something in Latin which roughly translates to, "If Marcus takes one more handful of the fish brine, I swear to Jupiter." Meanwhile, Marcus, the fish brine-loving centurion, is likely believing every dose is boosting his performance. That's early electrolyte theory for you. And as Rome's shadow stretched over continents, salt trailed behind like a faithful dog, nipping at the heels of empire, wagging its metaphorical tail through military camps and public baths alike. Speaking of those, Roman baths were not just centers of sponge-based gossip. They were briny playgrounds of leisure. Salt played a role in their rituals too, for skin, for purification, for the sheer salty sense of luxury. Even the emperors got in on the act. One particularly pragmatic Stoic, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, likely understood the value of salt not merely for strategy, but as a symbol of temperance. After all, nothing sharpens a sleepy philosopher's soup quite like a well-measured pinch of sodium chloride. Back in the realm of military pragmatism, Roman engineers, brilliant as clockwork, knew that an army might march on its stomach, but it camped on its salt. At the end of long campaigns, salt stores were inventoried as carefully as weapon caches. It wasn't just sustenance, it was assurance, a salty safety net against spoilage and starvation. So next time you find yourself delicately seasoning a bowl of sleepy soup, give a small nod, eyes half-lidded, to the sandy boots of Roman soldiers and their salted pay, to the road builders whose picks clinked in time with legionary hearts, and to the infinite crunch of salt beneath ancient sandals. Far from the fires of war, we now begin to drift away from the rigid rhythms of empire and into something softer, a tale where salt doesn't just pay men or pave roads, but sweetens even the most spiritual of ceremonies. So close your eyes gently, for ahead, something sacred stirs in the temple air. Chapter 9 of Salt Roads and Silent Footsteps. Close your eyes and picture this: a winding path of dust and hoofprints cutting through the gentle hush of an ancient European forest. Drowsy sunlight dapples everything in gold. The trees bend in quiet courtesy as merchants shuffle past, their packs jingling faintly with, well, not gold, not gems, but salt. Yes, salt. Crumbly, chalky, entirely unshiny salt. And yet, friends, it was precious enough to risk sore feet, storms, and the occasional very angry goat. Tonight, let us dream step along the old salt roads, the secret silvery threads that stitch together the ancient world. Long before asphalt and cranky traffic jams, there were salt paths that twisted across continents like sleepy snakes. The Celts had their routes. The Romans had theirs, naturally straighter and smugger. And even before paved roads were a twinkle in an engineer's toga, people were shuffling salt across staggering distances. Why? Well, unlike modern humans armed with refrigeration and an alarming addiction to ketchup, ancient civilizations depended on salt to preserve food. Without it, a brave Roman legionary's lunch might turn into a reenactment of why not to eat leftovers from 4 days ago. These trails, often trodden by foot, donkey, and occasionally very confused pigs, were not just practical, they were lifelines. The Hallein Salt Road, in what is now Austria, was a celebrated thoroughfare for Celtic salt. The Celts, a people fond of elaborate moustaches and even more elaborate burial sites, dug salt by hand from the earth, packed it into barrels, and trundled it across mountains to trade for wine, tools, and maybe a decent beard comb. While these trails might not glitter like silk routes or echo with grand tales like spice caravans, they were vital and dreamy in their earthy, forest-scented way. Imagine travelers setting campfires by murmuring brooks, the subtle shimmer of salt dust catching in the twilight air as tales were swapped in hushed tones. Some swore the salt sparkled brighter when moonlight hit it. Others claimed that salt attracted foxes with a taste for trail mix. Further south, the Via Salaria, literally the Salt Road, connected Rome to the Adriatic coast. It was older than the Republic itself, walked by Sabines and Latins long before Julius Caesar insisted on being fashionably late to his own assassination. Soldiers marched it, merchants dragged cartwheels along it, and donkeys complained loudly about it. But it did the job, bringing salt from the coast into the Roman heartland, where it seasoned everything from soups to Senate backstabbings. Interestingly, the Latin word salarium, which would later stretch itself into our modern word salary, gets its name from salt. It's widely believed Roman legionaries were paid a stipend that included or was meant to purchase salt, so you weren't just earning your bread, you were earning your seasoning. Talk about tasteful pay. Salt roads weren't just European inventions. In Africa, particularly across the Sahara, camel caravans wound tirelessly through scorching sands, hauling blocks of salt so big they could double as minimalist furniture. The Mali Empire, golden and resplendent, dealt in salt as though it were precious metal, which, for their purposes, it might as well have been. Timbuktu, aside from being a delightful word to try saying sleepily, was a major hub of both learning and salty commerce. But our stroll tonight stays among Europe's sleepy hills and cool woods, those soft, unhurried places where salt glistened on mulebacks and towns grew up like moss along the trail. Entire villages sprouted simply because they were on the right road at the right salty time. Taverns emerged not for weary travellers, but for the even wearier hooves of their livestock. Legends flickered into existence of salt thieves with whisper-silent sandals, or of ghosts who followed the scent of brine. The beauty of the Salt Road lies not just in its usefulness, but in its quiet persistence. No great battles were fought over it, not often at least. No glittering treasure guarded it, and yet it shaped economies, built empires, and salted recipes for thousands of years. An invisible empire, all crusted over with the quiet power of sodium chloride. So if you ever wander through a quiet meadow with an oddly straight path that seems to yearn towards somewhere, be kind to it. It might have once hosted the footfalls of merchants dreaming of pickled cabbage and paychecks they could taste. And with that, as twilight knits soft shadows across the trail, let us curl deeper into this slumbery world. Just ahead, our journey keeps winding, towards steamy kitchens, royal whims, and salty oaths whispered in warm-lit market halls. Chapter 10. The Salt Routes of Silence. Let us drift now, like caravans beneath desert moons, following a trail not of gold or silk, but one far humbler. Salt. Carved into the earth's skin like secret seams, the ancient salt routes once wound through empires and wilderness, quiet arteries delivering the flavor of life to distant mouths. Imagine this: nightfall over the Sahara, a velvet sky rippling with stars, a slow procession of camels, each with feet as soft on sand as whispers on silk, laden with slabs of crystallized salt, massive shimmering bricks called white gold. They sway beneath bundles of dates and bolts of cloth. Their drivers, Tuareg nomads in indigo veils, hum low songs passed down like lullabies. No one speaks much. The desert is a place for silence, where even the breeze seems to tiptoe. Salt, precious and ponderous, was taken from mines like those in Taodeni, Mali, a bleak and ghostly place so remote it makes the moon seem suburban. Enslaved workers deepened the shafts under a bleached sun, hacking out blocks of salt with wooden tools, each with the weight of a small child. The salt would then journey hundreds of miles down ancient paths to places like Timbuktu, which, contrary to how it sounds, was once a very real city and not the punchline of travel jokes. A bustling trading post on the edge of the known world, where camel met scribe and salt met gold. But the sandy roads weren't the only salt-laced lifelines. In Europe, tracks like the Via Salaria, yes, the Salt Road, carried salt from the Adriatic Sea to Rome long before Caesar learned to declaim dramatically in togas. Roman soldiers once walked these same routes, their boots collecting dust and destiny in equal parts. Salt trade routes made cities. They made empires. They made sore feet. Italy gets most of the salt glory, of course. Rome literally paid some of its soldiers in salt. Yes, our beloved salary comes from salarium, a payment made so legionnaires could buy their own savory seasoning and not go about their conquering days bland and undersalted. A dull-tongued legionnaire was no legionnaire at all, apparently. And while the Romans were chiseling out salt-based civil service on foot, over in China, horses and humans trekked along the old Salt Horse Road, through mist-wrapped mountains, over treacherous passes. They ferried salt bricks south from Sichuan across the plateaus toward Tibet. Traders risked altitude-induced forgetfulness and the occasional Yeti bluff. Not well documented, but heavily whispered. Even harsher was the Japanese archipelago's answer to the salt journey. Due to their volcanic islands lacking any significant salt deposits, the Japanese developed the art, nay, the solemn science, of extracting salt from seawater. This required elaborate seaweed filtering, sun-drying, and acquiring the patience level of a Buddhist monk babysitting a kettle. Some routes were perilous, others were peaceful. All were lined with salt and necessity. Let your thoughts trail now to the footsteps of porters and donkey caravans along the salt roads of the Andes. From vast salt flats like Bolivia's Salar de Uyuni, so luminous and quiet it tricks the clouds into walking on it. Families would gather salt crusts in dazzling diamond-bright light. It was crop and currency, lunchbox and ledger. It may seem peculiar now, when salt rattles out of plastic shakers in every diner from Mumbai to Milwaukee. But then, most magic loses its mystery under fluorescent lights. Back then, salt was spirit and soul. Entire economies moved at the foot speed of salted caravans. If you listen closely, you can still catch the ghost tinkling of camel harnesses crossing some long-buried trail. Still catch the glint of grainy treasure under the well-walked earth. Salt, it turns out, made perfect baggage. Heavy, necessary, unignorable. And so we dream on, following the soft crunch of ancient feet across the continents, along pathways etched not by swords or prayers, but by preservation and quiet commerce. Ahead, in the distance of dusk, a new scent begins to drift on the breeze. A scent not of spice or wind, but of salt stacked high, prepared to spark ancient conflicts. Our next steps lead into restless city walls and the price of salt in power. Chapter 11. The Roman Salt Roads and the Empire that seasoned the world. Close your eyes and imagine a long white ribbon unfurling across a sun-drenched Italian landscape. It winds and coils through hills and wheat fields, past sleepy villas and grumpy donkeys. This is not a trail of clouds or a misplaced toga tie. It's the Via Salaria, or quite literally, the Salt Road. The ancient Romans, those industrious overachievers of engineering and empire, had a rather elegant philosophy about life. Conquer broadly, bath regularly, and never underestimate the importance of seasoning. They built their world on stone, discipline, and a surprisingly passionate affection for sodium chloride. The Via Salaria was no ordinary road. It was older than Rome itself, a prehistoric path first trodden by the Sabines, an Italic tribe whose name sounds like a particularly stern citrus fruit. These mountain folk had one crucial need: salt for preserving food, especially meat, and the coast, dear listener, held their prize. As Rome rose, transforming from muddy village to imperial center, the old salt path became a vital artery in the body of an empire. Stretching from the Adriatic Sea straight into the heart of Rome, the Via Salaria wasn't just a road, it was the salt-carrying lifeline of the capital. Salt caravans, often hauled by oxen who looked permanently unimpressed, trudged along it daily. Traders clutched their amphorae, large jars filled with precious white crystals, as if holding treasure. And in a way they were. Salt wasn't just for livening up chickpeas and brining olives. It was a currency of sorts, a preservative that determined how long one could endure between harvests, or, perhaps more practically, between defeats in battle. Now, much has been said about Roman roads, most of it by scholars, and some of it, let's be honest, by people stuck in modern Italian traffic. But the Romans did more than just pave paths. They crafted economic corridors. The Via Salaria carried salt, yes, but also gossip, wine, orders from generals, and the occasional runaway goat. So important was salt to the Roman diet and economy that it influenced not only logistics, but language itself. The Latin word salarium, originally referred to the money given to soldiers so they could purchase salt. That's right. Your modern salary has humble, grainy origins. Perhaps next payday, spare a thought for the long-gone legionnaire carefully counting out his salarium, deciding whether to spend it on salt or sandals. There's soothing irony in the fact that a mineral born of evaporation fueled an empire known for its unstoppable expansion. The Romans built salt works along the coasts, shallow pools intentionally left to bake under the Italian sun, slowly distilling crusty treasure from the sea. It was an elegant chemistry, requiring nothing but salt water, patience, and an uncomfortable lack of shade. Salt helped Roman armies march. Rations of salted pork, dried fish, and preserved vegetables kept soldiers fed through frigid northern campaigns and sunburnt sieges alike. Salt preserved food long past the reign of the lemon fridge and the Tupperware dynasty. And in the Forum, where togas rustled and senators made urgent speeches about wine taxes or the appropriate length of a sandal strap, salt found its place too. It was sprinkled over religious offerings, cast into holy fires, and even tossed, now and then, by a superstitious cook anxious about seasoning the emperor's soup. Even the city's infamous Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewage systems and arguably its most gloriously named, participated in the Great Salt Cycle. Waste from salted foods flushed along ceramic channels, eventually returning to the rivers and seas, completing salt's journey in Rome. And what a journey it had, from the coast to the capital, in muscular ox carts and in the folds of tunics. Salt wound its way into every crusty corner of Roman life. It cut through hills, crept beneath arches, and seasoned an empire's rise. 1,000,000 miles of Roman ambition, all lightly dusted with salt. Now, if your eyelids are as heavy as those salted amphorae after a long day's march, you're not alone. The Roman world was vast, but slow-paced, and filled with rhythmic sounds. Cartwheels creaking, sandals shuffling, distant voices echoing in marble courtyards. So rest, dear listener. Ahead lies another sleepy swirl of history, a story about salt's sticky role in ancient ceremonies and sacred rites. But for now, let the road wind quietly under the moon-drenched sky and dream of sandals on stone. Seasoned dreams await. Chapter 12. The Salt Roads of the Sahara. Camels, contracts, and caravans. There's something strangely peaceful about imagining a caravan creaking along the golden sands beneath a moonlit Sahara sky, isn't there? The air cool, the stars scattered like forgotten salt crystals in the heavens, and at the center of it all, salt. Not gold, not silk, not spices, but salt, packed into slabs, stacked on camelback like chalky Jenga pieces. Let's wander slowly into the heart of West Africa, where the ground rustles with history and the dunes themselves might murmur contracts if you press your ear close enough. We've entered the world of the trans-Saharan salt trade. Long before trucks, hashtags, or overnight delivery, Saharan merchants were moving precious slabs of salt across a desert the size of the continental United States. No GPS, no rest stops, just camel hooves, sun-baked roots, and the delicious hope that no one's map-reading cousin had gotten them deeply lost. It's tempting to imagine that these traders worked in loud, bustling markets every day, but really, much of their lives were defined by the silence between cities. Stillness broken only by the steady, sand-muffled clop of camel feet. These weren't touristy joyrides. They were major economic arteries coursing like a slow pulse from the salt mines of Taudeni in the north to the wealthy city of Timbuktu and further south beyond the Niger River. Now, If the word salt mine conjures images of grumpy dwarves swinging pickaxes to a Disney tune, let's gently revise that mental image. The salt mines of Taudeni were, and to some extent still are, rectangular pits dug deep into the crust of the desert. Sweating under the sun, workers would slice enormous chunks of salt, known as cham amole, or salt bars, to be carried away to distant lands. Each slab weighed around 30 kilograms, or in sleepier terms, about the weight of 4 drowsy cats stacked in a trench coat. These bars weren't just cargo, they were currency. In fact, across parts of West Africa, salt was used quite literally as money, traded for gold, ivory, grain, and yes, sometimes even for other people. A single salt slab could be worth more than its weight in gold, depending on how far you were from the nearest mine and how deep your household's salt addiction ran. And nothing said "I love you" in a medieval African economy quite like putting down a pristine slab of narkle at your next livestock negotiation. Camel caravans, majestic if slightly irritable ships of the desert, carried these salt slabs with the balance and grace of disgruntled librarians. They travelled in enormous packs, sometimes numbering in the thousands. Picture a meandering conga line of camels with square salt bricks strapped to their sides, and you have the rough outlines of early international shipping. Guiding them were Tuareg nomads, ancient navigators of the sands, whose knowledge of winds, stars, and secret oases would make your average weather app hang its head in shame. These guides didn't just walk. No, they glided, soot-crusted scarves wrapped proudly around their heads, steering their salt-laden ships through storms, mirages, and the occasional pushy border taxman. Of course, the journey wasn't all sublimely spiritual and economically enchanting. Caravans risked dehydration, sandstorms, and bandits, who probably spent more time arguing about who got the better slab than actually stealing it. And wolves, no, too warm for wolves. But the true predators were time, exhaustion, and the occasional overly grumpy camel with boundary issues. When they did reach Timbuktu or Gao, these traders entered cities gleaming with scholarship, music, and markets. Salt met gold. Words met parchment. Ideas from Arabia, Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa mingled in soft harmony. As locals weighed slabs and counted coins, children might have nibbled cautiously on the corners of salt blocks, just to check authenticity, you know. Always best to taste test your currency. But the importance of this journey wasn't just about economics. It was a dance between geography, culture, and resilience. Salt helped weave far-flung empires together. Through salt, different people learned each other's ways, traded not just goods, but stories, and sometimes suspiciously intelligent goats. So next time you casually reach for your salt shaker, imagine the journey those grains once symbolized. Across dunes, over centuries, balanced carefully on the back of a camel, contemplating its life choices under a withering sun. And as the stars rise again above the desert wind, let's curl in closer to the weightless warmth of legend, drifting gently toward the tale of how salt built entire cities from grains of determination. Chapter 13. A pinch of salt and a heap of gold, the Egyptian way. If you were an ambitious merchant in ancient Egypt, you might have dreamed not of palaces or pyramids, but of salt. Yes, salt. Humble, grainy, and utterly vital. In this dreamy chapter, we drift down the slow curls of the Nile, where papyrus rustles under moonlight, crocodiles blink slowly in reed-shadowed silence, and the economy smells faintly of preserved fish. Salt in Egypt was more than flavor. It was life, and a rather profitable one at that. The Nile may have gifted the land with fertile silt, but it wasn't terribly generous when it came to salt. So where did Egyptians get it? Well, like many of history's sleep-deprived logistics managers, they turned to evaporation. Salt was harvested from saline lakes and marshes, dried under the sun, scraped into baskets, and carted carefully across baking sands to where it was needed most: the kitchens, the market stalls, and, rather grimly, to the embalming tables. Ah yes, mummification. Nothing says sacred ritual quite like smothering a body in natron, an ancient desiccant primarily composed of salt, for 70 days. In modern terms, the Egyptians basically turned their ancestors into well-preserved jerky. Respectfully, of course. Very respectfully. Natron, specifically, was a naturally occurring mix of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, with a generous helping of table salt and a pinch of magic, or science, depending on how many cats you've mummified. The point is, without salt, the entire concept of eternal rest might have spoiled in the sun. But even for the still breathing, salt held sway. It played its part in trade and taxation. In towns like Siwa and Natrun, salt wasn't just an industry, it was wealth, status, power. Salt blocks were carted through desert trade routes like chalky little treasure chests, guarded by camels and sunburnt optimism. And in typical bureaucratic fashion, the pharaoh's officials made sure everyone paid their proper grain, or in this case, their pinch of portable white gold. And like any good economy, there were taxes. Oh, were there taxes? Ancient tax collectors weren't chasing unpaid parking tickets or latte deductions. They were counting sacks of salt. There's even a delightful little scribal record from the Middle Kingdom, written in soothing, suspiciously tidy hieroglyphs, complaining about incomplete salt accounts in a rural district. Can't have that. After all, how else could one fund temple's pyramid maintenance an executive-grade eyeliner? Because yes, even the elite cosmetic industry of the Nile had its salty secrets. Salt was an ingredient in certain eye paint recipes. A swipe of coal may have warded off the evil eye or sandflies, but it also might have been held together with a drop of saline science. And if your eyeliner said you were powerful, your salt bill said you were important enough to stay that way. Salt, as it turns out, flowed through Egyptian civilization not in grains, but in responsibility, nourishing armies, preserving food for long desert marches, and keeping bureaucrats very busy with papyrus spreadsheets. So vital was it that it inspired stories, remedies, rituals, and possibly a few trade disputes that would have looked perfectly at home in an office meeting with sandals. And while we drift here, wrapped in the dusk of a desert sky, it's rather sweet, no savory, to imagine a civilization held together, not just by stone and river, but by something so simple as a mineral, one that could seal a fish, embalm a priest, or smooth the lines under a queen's eyes. Quite a resume for a grainy rock, wouldn't you say? So let us unroll our little reed mat here beside the Nile, listen to the lullaby of frogs and slow boats rocking gently, and trace the salt roads with our minds, dry, winding tracks across the desert, lit by moonrise and the soft jangle of camel bells. In the distance, we can almost hear traders nearing the ruins of Carthage. But that's a salty story, still waiting to unfold. Chapter 14. The Whispering Vaults of Venice. Now drift with me into the misty corridors of a city that floats, a place stitched together by moonlit canals and secrets sealed beneath heavy stone. Tonight, we find ourselves in Venice, sometime between the whirl of medieval trade and the sighs of Renaissance art. when salt was not only a seasoning, but a state strategy. The Venetian Republic was many things: elegant, elusive, and exquisitely crafty. It looked like a place where gondolas lull the stars to sleep. But behind the swooning facades and fluttering silks, Venice was also an economic magician, turning quiet salt into loud power. You see, Venice didn't just trade salt, it wove salt into a kind of quiet empire. Let's start in the salt flats, a few dreamy leagues from Venice, in places like Chioggia and Cervia. Salt was harvested in wide shimmering pans that blinked in the summer light like sleepy mirrors. Workers known as salinari scooped the white crystals under a heat that could fry a fig on a windowsill. Not exactly a cozy job, but one whose produce had tremendous value, especially when the Republic got creative. Venetians, lovers of order and opulence, built strict regulations around salt. It became a state-controlled commodity, managed by something called, and yes, this actually sounds like bedtime bureaucracy, the Magistrato del Sale, or Salt Magistracy, a very serious body overseeing something that literally gets sprinkled on pasta. They didn't allow just anyone to dabble in the salt game. No, the salt trade was artfully monopolized. The Republic bought salt cheap from producers, then turned around and sold it to their own citizens, and even neighboring states, at impressively inflated prices. It was legal and wildly profitable. Salt became so important to Venice's survival that it wasn't stored just anywhere. It slumbered in massive fortress-like warehouses called saloni da sal, carefully guarded against moisture, theft, and possibly gossip. These salt vaults were the whispering bellies of a city that knew the sweetest riches didn't always glitter. On quiet nights, much like this one, if you listened closely outside a warehouse window, you could almost hear the crystals dreaming of Tuscan tables and Hungarian hams. Now, because Venice controlled not just the salt, but the routes salt traveled through, it built prosperity on salinity. Neighboring cities that once scoffed at granules were now, quietly, and perhaps a bit resentfully, buying from the Republic. This, in what can only be described as an elegantly salty move, made Venice richer than most kings, all without the sword. But Venetians, clever creatures of satin and strategy, didn't stop there. They knew that one does not simply store salt, one curates it. Different types of salt were traded for different occasions. Flor de sal, the delicate flower of salt, skimmed from the surface of evaporation ponds, was prized like white gold, tucked into silk sachets for the homes of the elite. Coarser kitchen salts lined barrels that would sail to distant ports like Alexandria or Constantinople. And within Venice itself, salt became a quiet social divider. Wealthy households might gift one another rare salts from the Dead Sea or the Atlantic, as refined and showy as any jewel. Meanwhile, the everyday folk still relied on local salt for preserving fish and seasoning their humble stews. In essence, the Venetians transformed a plain mineral into a cultural currency. Salt kept wars at bay, merchants afloat, and canals, well, slightly brinier than before. Even more curious, the profits from the salt trade helped fund the construction of churches, palazzos, and even the famous Arsenale, Venice's shipbuilding megafactory that churned out vessels like a slow, creaking dream. Salt, quietly sitting in shadowed vaults, was helping launch ships across the known world. It's odd to think, isn't it, that beneath the serenades of gondoliers and the golden halos of Byzantine mosaics, it was the humble salt crystal, that invisible spark on your tongue, that kept the city breathing. And as Venetian merchants traced their fingers across maritime maps, plotting paths through Adriatic mists and Mediterranean winds. They knew that where salt could go, power followed. So the next time your footstep echoes against a Venetian stone, remember, you're tiptoeing through a city built not just on dreams, but on what was once called white gold. Now, let the canals carry us further, towards southern spice winds and a city where every flavor flirted with salt, even when pretending not to. Our sails turn to Sicily next, where volcanoes, olives, and salted capers await. Chapter 15. The Salty Silk of Rome. Roads, rations, and Roman wages. Shh, softly now. Tonight, we drift across the cobbled rhythm of ancient Rome. Not its emperors, not its amphitheaters, not even its overworked gossip grapevines, but something a little grainer. Let's talk about what really made the Roman Empire tick. Not Caesar, not conquest, but crystals. Tiny, mineral-seasoned ones we know as salt. Picture it, the eternal city, not yet eternal, dusted with toga-wrapped senators and sandal-clad citizens, all shuffling around, each of them more devoted to their daily salt rations than to their daily debates. No matter how much political power you wielded, there was nothing quite like salting your asparagus. And so, like every great state, Rome made it official. They built roads, straight, spectacular roads, for soldiers, yes, but also for salt. One of the oldest Roman roads was, in fact, the Via Salaria. Name ring a bell? It should, because it literally means salt road. It was the path that brought salt from the Adriatic Sea inland, passing through countryside, hill town, and the occasional cow who wandered into commuting lanes. Salt was hauled by donkey cart, trudging mile after dusty mile, all so Rome's citizens could have savoury olives and soldiers could stay upright. You see, salt wasn't only for flavour or preserving that suspiciously pink pork. It was essentially ancient Gatorade, electrolytes before we had any idea what ions were. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid partly in salt, from which we get the word salary. It wasn't quite direct deposit, it was more like direct seasoning. Imagine being handed a pouch of salt flakes on payday and thinking, ah yes, another productive month of conquering Gaul. Time to hit the tavern and sprinkle my wealth across a well-aged anchovy. Warm? No. Convenient? Not entirely. Tangy? Absolutely. This salted stipend was sometimes called salarium, a root word for more than wealthy wallets, a term that would echo down the centuries and confuse countless fifth graders. The logic, of course, was practical. Salt was essential for the preservation of meats, the replenishment of sweaty legionnaires, and the continued snack-worthiness of the imperial pantry. Thus, a soldier's salt wasn't just seasoning, it was strength. The Roman diet, dense with salty garum, a fermented fish sauce that was, shall we say, an acquired taste with an assertive scent, made salt even more indispensable. Did it smell good? No. Did it taste like victory and herring? Probably. The Roman palate was brave, and salt was its valiant squire. And let's pause to admire the sheer bureaucracy of it all. For Rome never met a good substance it didn't want to tax. Salt was no exception. Roman officials oversaw Salinus, the government-run salt works, with the kind of quiet pride usually reserved for vineyard owners or catapult engineers. If it could be weighed, counted, and taxed, it belonged to the empire. And salt, well, it was basically white gold. That stuck to your fingers. Now, let us meander through a slow sunset in Roman Gaul. A merchant wagon trundles past, its wheels complaining across the ruts in the road, sacks of salt wrapped safely beneath tarps. A guard stands watch at a toll station, yawning beneath his helmet, collecting small pouches of granules as payment. In a nearby village, children chase each other near the square as their mother sprinkles a dusty pinch of salt into her clay pot. Tonight's stew, revived and preserved, just like stories over firelight. Though it seems quaint now, imagining a whole civilization seasoning its way through history. This was the granular glue that helped hold Rome together. Trade boosted its economy. Soldiers marched because of it. Merchants scuffled competitively to ship it faster, farther, and with fewer donkeys fainting along the way. Salt didn't just support the empire. It crystallized it, formed a savory spine behind its marble mirror. And in the depth of nightfall, when olive oil lamps dropped into flicker and fields turned quiet under Mediterranean stars, someone was always stirring salt into gruel or rubbing it onto ham. A reminder that power in Rome was never just about law or legion, but sometimes about a tiny mineral with mighty flavor. Now rest. Let the road straighten before you and the scent of salted air drift across your dreams. And next, we'll tumble gently into the spice-scented shadows of ancient markets, where salt met the silks and spices of far-off lands. Chapter 16. The Roman paycheck that poured from a salt shaker. Picture, if you will, a dusty Roman soldier, sunburnt, sandal-footed, slightly annoyed at how heavy his helmet is, standing in formation on a sweltering afternoon. His shield is strapped to his left arm. His gladius is glinting at his side, and somewhere deep inside his travel-worn satchel lies his salary. Not coins, not gold, not even chickens. No, dear dreamer, it's salt. Yes, that humble crystal you currently associate with potato chips and kitchen clumsiness was once so prized in the Roman Empire that soldiers were quite literally paid in salarium, a stipend, in some cases, originally meant for purchasing salt, or perhaps even directly consisting of salt itself. Imagine campaigning across Gaul, only to receive your paycheck in a salty pouch. Some historians dispute whether the payment was in literal salt or merely symbolic of it. But either way, the connection was strong enough that the Latin word salarium would eventually wander forward through time, evolve, and sit neatly in your modern vocabulary as salary. It's enough to make your piggy bank feel underseasoned. Romans, as organized as they were obsessive, understood early on that keeping frontline troops alive required more than courage, steel, and public bathhouses. It required salt, a preservative for food, a healer of wounds, and once again, a handy pre-currency commodity that you could slap in a jar and tell someone, "Congratulations, you now have value." Salt could preserve meat for long travels, flavor bland barley mush, a Roman favorite, and, when cleverly mixed with vinegar and water, become a rudimentary sports drink for the toga-wearing elite. Move over, electrolytes. Ancient Rome had cracked the code. Now, Roman roads weren't just marvels of engineering. They were also salty superhighways. The Via Salaria, or Salt Road, stretched like a glittering artery across the Italian landscape, pulsing with caravans of salt-laden mules moving from the Adriatic coast inland toward Rome, where the Senate probably debated things like aqueduct policy and whose toga looked wrinkled. And while we're on the topic, let's gently remember that ancient Roman senators wore togas measuring over 12 feet long. Truly, nothing says the empire is thriving, quite like choosing formal wear that doubles as a small sail. But back to the salt. This strategic white mineral made Rome's conquest possible. Picture the empire like a giant sea sponge, soaking up territories from the misty moors of Britain to the flower-scented shores of North Africa. always pressing forward, dusted boots crunching on salted roads. With salt, Roman supply chains became streamlined. Galleys hummed along the coast hauling this precious treasure, and inland garrisons remained provisioned and perky. An army marches on its stomach, as the old saying goes. But in Rome's case, it might have shuffled along with salt-crusted bread in one hand and pickled vegetables in the other, muttering, "Not another vinegar ration," in Latin. Even across the sprawling imperial bureaucracy, salt played a cunning role. Civil workers, minor officials, and grain measurers all partook in the salarium economy, weaving salt into the very admin fiber of Rome. It became not just a preserved staple, but a preserved idea that survival could hinge on something that flakes between your fingers and disappears on the tongue. There's also a softly ironic twist in all this. Rome, that mightiest of early empires, had an economy partly lubricated by a mineral you can now find in tiny foil packets at highway diners. The same substance that seasoned emperor's salads was likely hiding under your car seat last Tuesday. Yet perhaps it's this simplicity that made salt a perfect symbol of permanence and loyalty in Roman society. To eat salt with someone was a phrase denoting friendship, hospitality, and dignity. A reminder that even in an empire bloated with gold, marble, and complicated statues of eagles, the real connection lay in a shared table and a properly seasoned lentil stew. And so our Roman soldier, standing proud beneath the Mediterranean sun, clutching a shoulder sack filled with his earned salarium, might just smile as he crunches into a salted olive and thinks, "I'm rich and a little thirsty." Next, let us drift across the Mediterranean once more, to the lands of the desert winds, where caravans serpented across the sands, not for water, but for salt that gleamed brighter than silver. Chapter 17. The Salty Roads of the Roman Empire. Close your eyes, dear listener, and imagine a road. Not just any road, not the highway cluttered with honking carriages or the cobbles outside your favorite sleepy bakery. No, this is a road paved by sandals and time, by soldiers and merchants, and most importantly, by salt. Welcome to the Via Salaria, Rome's rather on-the-nose salt road, where ancient footsteps echo softly beneath layers of history and spice. Now, let's lull ourselves back in time, roughly 2,000 years to a Rome that smelled of olive oil, ambition, and a hint of wet marble. The Eternal City, with its ambitious aqueducts and a rather dramatic flair for togas, was held together not just by legions and laws, but by salt, quite literally. Salt was essential to life, trade, and dinner. And yes, even Roman soldiers, stoic men who could make a strong argument with just an eyebrow, were often paid in part with salt rations. Thus, we nudge gently toward the word salary, which trickled its way into our modern dictionaries from the Latin salarium, a word soaked in irony and sodium. The Via Salaria snaked its way from Rome all the way to the Adriatic Sea, approximately 150 miles of footsteps, wheels, and salty intentions. It was one of the many ancient trade routes delicately embroidered across the Italian peninsula. Through lush plains and sun-bleached hills, this road carried salt inlandward from the coastal salt pans. Imagine donkeys with bushels of white gold trudging step after step, accompanied by merchants who may or may not have known they were participating in one of history's quieter revolutions. And so, salt reached the heart of the Roman world, not simply as seasoning for their dormice or fish sauce, but as a vital necessity. Roman society, as buttoned up as it may seem in marble busts and stern histories, had a deliciously practical side. Salt preserved the meat, seasoned the bread, healed wounds, paid wages, and even held religious value. There were Roman rituals where salt and grain were tossed into flames as an offering to the gods. You might call it an ancient version of sprinkling seasoning before a dinner party, but with more incense and fewer napkin rings. Even Roman law acknowledged how crucial salt was. That's right. In an empire famed for its love of columns, conquests, and honorary titles, salt had a reserved seat at the table. So important were the salt routes and their salty payloads that Roman officials often dispatched special agents to guard and tax the salt trade. It was not uncommon, in the more bureaucratic chapters of Roman life, for civil squabbles to erupt over salt rights. Picture a toga-wearing official furiously scribbling scrolls to decide who had jurisdiction over briny granules. Bureaucracy has always had a flair for the overly specific, hasn't it? And yet, the Via Salaria was not only a trade route, it was a quiet witness to time itself. Travelers, citizens, and emperors rolled their carts or walked their lives along it for centuries. One could say that the road wasn't just made of stone and mortar, but of all the memories encoded in the grains of salt it carried. Whole histories wrapped in parchment, salted, and shipped. Let us also take a moment to appreciate how clever the Roman road engineers really were. These seasoned road makers didn't simply toss gravel about and hope for the best. They layered roads with care, a bottom layer of stones known as the statumen, then layers for drainage, firmness, and smoothness. Miles of roads, straight and true, some still walkable today, like whispered gym memberships passed down through generations of sandals. So consider this: every footstep on the Via Salaria carried more than its mere weight. It carried the balance of economies, the murmur of empires, and the taste of sustenance stretching between coast and capital. This ancient highway wasn't just an efficient path. It was, in its own way, the empire's salty lifeline. Now, as our cart of dreams slowly bumps along this old Roman road in the flickering candlelight of history, feel the soft weight of timelessness pressing gently on your eyelids. Ahead lies a curious stretch of story, where salt leaves the hands of emperors and enters the more peculiar pockets of the medieval church. But for now, rest easy and let the Via Salaria wind its quiet path across your dreams. Chapter 18: The Empire That Pickled the World. There comes a moment in every salt-soaked historical tale when Rome saunters into the scene. Toga flowing, sandals tapping authoritatively on mosaic floors, eyes fixed firmly on conquest, taxes, and of course, salt. Always salt. Tonight, dear listener, let us drift gently into the heart of the Roman Empire, but not to watch emperors fiddle or legions march. No, tonight we roam their kitchens, their trade routes, and perhaps a soldier's sweaty lunch satchel to discover just how Rome salted its way into history. You see, to the Romans, salt wasn't merely a seasoning. It was a state-sanctioned institution, the empire's quiet obsession. Salarium argentum, quite literally, the salt money, was possibly paid to soldiers to help them purchase salt. Whether this is the precise root of the modern word salary is debated by historians, of course. Who else would quibble at such a comfortable hour? But what is certain is that Rome recognized salt as essential, not just for taste, but for preserving legions' rations, curing olives, and naturally asserting control. Ah yes, control. If Rome had an unofficial motto beyond senatus, populusque Romanus, it might have been, build the roads and salt shall follow. The famed Via Salaria, Latin for salt road, served as one of the Republic's earliest and most important trade routes. Stretching from the salt marshes at the Tiber's mouth, the Via Salaria delivered that chalky flavor gold into the mouths and market stalls of a swelling empire. A Roman housewife perched on her modest stool with a pot of lentils bubbling nearby knew the value of a good pinch of salt. She might have handed a few denarii to a merchant from Ostia, who retrieved it from salt pans shimmering in the Mediterranean sun. Those marshes were ancient factories, quiet, steaming, sunlit pockets where seawater laid down its liquid life, evaporated, then left crunchy treasure behind. But salt wasn't just a kitchen affair. The governance of salt was serious business. Roman administrators, never ones to let a tax opportunity go unsqueezed, understood this elemental craving. Salt was taxed, priced, apportioned, and sometimes even withheld, a potent symbol of imperial grip. To control salt was to control hunger and health, two things the empire preferred to keep under reliable surveillance. And yet, even the mighty Caesars could not salt the sea of mystery that swirled around the stuff. Superstitions drifted easily through Roman kitchens and baths. Salt was sacred. Tossing a pinch over the shoulder wasn't merely clumsy seasoning. It was said to blind the devil lurking just behind you. This quaint belief, born in salty antiquity, still lives on today, staving off evil during brunch mishaps and dinner party whispers alike. Down at the forums, echoing markets of marble and mischief, salt stalls sat beside honey pots and wine jugs. Salted fish, especially garum, enjoyed a stardom that defies modern logic. Imagine a thick brown liquid. Fermented fish innards mingled with salt and sunshine until alchemy occurred. And what resulted wasn't disgust, but demand. Garum was Rome's answer to ketchup, sriracha, and Worcestershire sauce rolled into one briny elixir. Every social class dipped their bread in garum. Senators slathered it on dormice, and plebeians stirred it into stews. It was salt's ultimate expression, preserved, fermented, unapologetically pungent. Garum factories cropped up along coastlines, leaving archaeological sites still suspiciously smelly to this day. The people clamored for it. The empire provided it. Meanwhile, somewhere, a Roman accountant quietly tallied the salt output with loving precision. Even Roman medicine had a salty streak. Sal applied to wounds, saltwater rinses for sore throats, and of course, cauterization advice that would make you feel better only in comparison to the sensation of being alive without it. Still, the ancients trusted salt to protect, preserve, and purify. Not just bodies, but homes, boundaries, and even fledgling cities. When a newborn Roman crossed into the world, family rituals sometimes involved salt, a purifying agent for the fragile flicker of new life. And when an enemy city fell, the Romans would sow salt into the soil, famously, or perhaps apocryphally, at Carthage. A fierce symbolic act, like telling the earth itself to forget. So tonight, as the stars blink quietly over imagined Roman baths, picture salt not as the quiet shaker on your dinner table, but as a force, a mineral diplomat, a kitchen soldier, a bureaucratic obsession, and a secretive ally to empires. Let's gently turn from Rome now, as the salt roads fade beneath twilight and olive trees sigh lullabies. Ahead, another salty trail winds eastward, toward the ancient lands of China, where salt would take on new meanings in porcelain bowls and hands of emperors. Chapter 19. The salty secret behind warrior wages. Sink a little deeper into your pillows, dear listener, and imagine the creak of leather sandals echoing down a Roman road. The sun is setting over the empire. Not flamboyantly, but with just enough golden drama to make you think Jupiter might be watching with crossed arms and a modest grin. Tonight's tale is about legions, lire, and lump sums of salt. Yes, prepare yourself for the dazzlingly drowsy world of military pay. You see, for many a Roman soldier, the road to glory was paved not only in stone, but in sodium chloride. And while we often picture coin purses gleaming with golden ore, or bundles of tetradrachms jingling like ancient maracas, there's something delightfully humdrum that deserves its due credit: salarium. Yes, that Latin root for our modern word salary comes from sal, the Roman word for salt. Now, whether Roman soldiers were literally handed salt as a form of payment, or simply received money to purchase salt, is still debated among scholars, many of whom are just enthusiastic enough to argue the point over a glass of red wine and a very long inscription. The evidence is, as they say, just unseasoned enough to stay ambiguous. Nevertheless, the fact remains, salt was so precious in the ancient world that it held financial power. When Emperor Augustus restructured the Roman Empire's military into a more professional standing force, a glorified job for sword swingers, he knew that paying them regularly was key, and if they weren't paid in sacks of salt, they were certainly paid because of it. Their salarium ensured loyalty, not just to Rome, but also to the dream of fresh seasoning in their next stew. And really, isn't that what civilization is all about? The promise of a properly flavored lentil. Many a Roman soldier marched thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and uncannily straight roads, all under the promise of a secure salary. This promise meant not only coins, but access to supplies, rations of grain, olive oil, wine, and of course, salt. Without it, their preserved meats would have leapt from edible to regrettable in no time at all. A soldier without salt is merely a man with a spear and an awfully confused stomach. The salt supplied to the army often came from government-controlled sources, state-run production sites near ports like Ostia, or salt pans around the Mediterranean basin. And while battles were fought with swords, they were also quietly won with logistics. An army marches on its stomach, the saying goes, and even Caesar would have lost his edge if his brisket turned funky before the first cavalry charge. Now, not all soldiers handled their finances wisely. Much like their modern counterparts, some blew their wages at the first town with a tavern and a particularly charming lute player. Others sent theirs home to mothers who, despite not appearing in the written records, absolutely had opinions about Roman hygiene, marital prospects, and the proper ratio of garum sauce to greens. But the system worked, mostly, until it didn't. There were times when soldiers revolted, not over battlefield losses, but unpaid salaries. It's hard to stay loyal to Rome when Rome forgot to garnish your paycheck with, well, garnish. In AD 69, for example, a year sometimes called the Year of the Four Emperors, which is precisely 3 too many, legions changed sides over money and promises, and probably the looming threat of flavorless rations. Some clever commanders even used salt access as a form of control. Imagine a smug centurion standing atop a cart of glistening salt bricks, brandishing a sack dramatically and announcing, "Loyalty today, flavor tomorrow." Motivation can wear many tunics. Of course, it wasn't just the Romans. Later empires and kingdoms, from Byzantium to the Islamic caliphates, understood the vital nature of salt in provisioning troops. But Rome had made it an institution, standard, expected, and dependable, like sandals with good arch support. So the next time you sprinkle a little salt on your dinner, just picture a weather-beaten legionary, smiling faintly beside a campfire, boots off, Gladius nearby, perhaps muttering something in Latin that loosely translates to, well, at least the stew tastes like something. And with that, let us now drift toward lands where merchants and monks entwine, where salt met scroll in monasteries cloaked in silence and spice. Onward we go. Chapter 20. The Salty Silk Road and the Whispering Camels. The desert wind doesn't whisper to everyone, but if you tilt your ear just right, and your imagination a little more, the sand tells stories, ancient ones, laced with spice, silk, and of course, salt. Welcome to the trade routes of Central Asia, where even the camels had salt stains on their lips and dreams of a more mineral-rich tomorrow. Tonight, we are padding softly through the salt-slick shadows of the Silk Road, a name much more romantic than the roads themselves, I must warn you. The Silk Road was not one road, but a twisty, sweaty, blustery spiderweb of routes spanning from China all the way to the Mediterranean. And while it famously traded shimmering silks and spicy spices in lower-profile caravans with less pizzazz, salt was also king. A grainy, dignified, quietly powerful king. Picture the Gobi Desert, a place where the sun doesn't shine, it sears. The dunes don't roll, they lurk. And among this vast beige infinity sat caravans, trundling along with drums of salt strapped tightly to their patient, knobbly camels. You see, when you have no refrigeration and dinners are prepared with less technique and more surviving, salt becomes less a luxury and more a raw necessity. Traders from China brought their exquisite salt blocks, quarried from dry lake beds and shaped like loaves of bread. These blocks weren't just for flavoring a Mongolian yak stew. They were currency, compressed culinary coin, a salted standard. Rumor has it, and sleep historians are quite fond of rumors, that some of these salt blocks were carved with characters or marks, not for beauty, but to indicate quality, origin, and perhaps a little brand pizzazz. Nothing says haute cuisine in 200 BCE like a salt stamp of your regional governor's face. Let's drift westward now, past the Tarim Basin, where mummy-wrapped merchants with perfectly preserved mustaches once strolled, into the Persian plateau, whose opulence shimmered even in the heat haze. Salt slab merchants stopped at oasis towns like Dunhuang, where they'd rest their cargo and their calloused feet. There, stories bloomed over meals, and languages mingled beautifully with the spices and sleepy laughter. Traders spoke of deals like love affairs, tender and treacherous, involving dozens of camels and that one suspicious Hungarian who oversalted the tea. One must understand, a salt merchant wasn't just a delivery llama with nice boots. They were walking law keepers. A spice trader and a salt dealer might swap more than goods. They exchanged jokes, weather reports, and the location of bandit-infested gorges. Yes, traders were a bit like early Yelp, TripAdvisor, and stand-up comedians, all bundled up in turbans and determination. Among the many linguistic treasures of the Silk Road came a little etymological gem, the word salary. Ah yes, here we swish back to Latin, a fancy linguistic backstroke, and to the Roman salarium, originally an allowance paid to soldiers for buying salt. That core connection between salt and payment refused to evaporate, like a determined puddle in Mesopotamian sun. The Persian merchant might not have used that Latin term, no, but he certainly paid his guards in salt or goods salted. A well-seasoned guard was a trustworthy one. Now, drift your mind to a caravanserai, one of those roadside inns that peppered the trading routes. Imagine a weary merchant lowering his sacks of salt as other traders sip mint tea. listening to tales of dunes crossed and near misses with marauding goats. A young apprentice, eyes wide as olives, watches as salt is weighed, sniffed, licked, yes really, and wrapped into trade-worthy bundles. It was treated reverently, this salt, not just to flavor food, but to preserve relationship-building camel cheese and to purify wounds from misguided attempts at desert swordplay. It had spiritual value too. Some caravans sprinkled salt around their sleeping quarters to ward off evil spirits, or sandflies, who, depending on who you ask, were more irritating. Salt traveled thousands of miles, clinking in stone jars, wrapped delicately in fabrics, or simply bundled into burlap, and it connected empires, from big spicy dynasties to tiny dusty monarchies with one camel and a dream. So as we snuggle into the warm folds of history, let us remember the gritty elegance of the salt traders, quietly fueling economies with their shimmering crystalline cargo, softly crunching underfoot and whispering into the dark corners of time. I may be small, but I am mighty. And next, we shall wander into the chambers of kings and queens, not for gossip, though there's plenty, but for how their palatial courts owed more to salt than you'd think, from salted pork diplomacy to bath rituals fit for the well-brined. Close your eyes now. Let the wind carry you from the salt-laden dunes of the east to the scented corridors of ancient courts, where royalty soaked and salted. Softly onward. Chapter 21. The Salt Roads of the Sahara. Close your eyes, if they aren't already drooping, and let's wander into the soft shimmer of sun-baked sands, where silence stretches wider than the sky itself. These are the ancient salt roads of the Sahara Desert, paths paved not with bricks or cobblestones, but with camel prints and dreams of sodium chloride. Imagine, if you will, an endless sea of ochre dunes, rolling like slow waves upon a sleepy ocean. No chirping birds, no babbling brooks, just the whisper of desert winds and the steady creak of wooden saddles. For centuries, these were the highways of gold and salt. Though funny enough, sometimes salt was worth more than gold. That's right, the white stuff you now casually flick onto your dinner once caused entire caravans to form, trudging through blistering sun and biting winds, all in the name of seasoning. Let us step back, gently, of course, to the 11th century. The kingdom of Ghana, not to be confused with the modern nation of Ghana, which sits happily to the south, flourished in West Africa. It was not ruled by a guy sprinkling herbs in a kitchen with flair, but rather by kings who understood the golden secret of salt. They controlled trade routes that funneled caravans between the salt mines in the northern Sahara and the gold fields of the south. The most famous of all these roads was perhaps the one leading from Tagaza, a lonely little oasis settlement located in what is now Mali. But describing Tagaza as a settlement is a bit generous. It was more of a salty mirage. The buildings, made almost entirely of salt blocks, even the mosques. Walk carefully. If you licked the walls, you'd be tasting someone's future currency. The product mined there wasn't the delicate flake salt you might sprinkle on roasted vegetables. No, it was raw, chunky slabs of hardened sodium glory, hewn from ancient beds underground. The miners endured unbearable heat and relentless dust, but they knew each glittering block might one day be traded for gold, grain, ivory, or even, in more luxurious times, silk. From Tagaza, caravans would begin their slow ceremonial crawl southward. These were not haphazard donkeys with bundles bouncing behind them. No, they were salt-laden expeditions of epic determination, led by the ultimate desert ships, camels. Oh, camels, those aloof desert connoisseurs of discomfort. Perfectly evolved for misery, with feet like squishy saucers, eyes shielded by long lashes, and an expression that says they've seen enough nonsense to last several lifetimes. A typical caravan might include hundreds or even thousands of these beasts, each carrying up to 300 pounds of salt, complaining about it under their breath, no doubt. And the desert, dear listener, was not kind. Temperatures ranged from unforgivably hot by day to rudely cold by night. Sandstorms could appear with the sudden chaos of a spilled spice rack, but the camel drivers would sing to each other in low, rhythmic chants, both to guide the caravan and to soothe their own salt-chapped souls. When the precious cargo eventually reached cities like Timbuktu or Gao, markets would spring to life. Traders bustled, gold glistened, scholars debated with animated hand gestures, and all because someone somewhere absolutely refused to eat a bland lentil stew. And here's a tender detail for your cozy little thoughts. Salt was often traded ounce for ounce with gold. Yes, entire economies, entire empires were literally seasoned to taste. Some Arabic travelers found this bizarre. Why, they asked, do these people give gold for salt? But, oh, try baking bread in the desert without it. Try preserving food when your refrigerator is a hole in the ground. Salt wasn't a luxury. It was life itself, finely granulated. Over time, the salt roads faded as trade shifted and sea routes took over. But the ghostly camel trail still snakes softly through the dunes, whispering tales of glittering slabs that once held empires upright. As you drift further into the hush of history, the sands continue to glow under moonlight, and the footprints of the ancient caravans sink gently into sleep. Let us follow them just a little further into the night, to a land where salt didn't just build dinner, but cities and kingdoms too. Chapter 22. The Venetian Trick: Salt, Silk and Subtle Swindling. Let's drift to the glimmering lagoons of medieval Venice now, where the sunsets were golden, the gondolas quiet, and everyone smelled faintly of fish and profit. Picture the Grand Canal rippling just enough to make the moonlight dance, while masked merchants and robed dodgers invented subtle ways to make a fortune without actually producing much of anything, which is impressive and suspicious. Venice, in its prime, was more than just picturesque canals and dramatic bird masks. It was a glittering hub of mercantile cunning, a city where boats were the bloodstream and bargaining a native language. And at the soft, grainy beating heart of it all, salt, deliciously dull little salt. Now, while Venice didn't have great natural salt flats like their rivals across the Adriatic, they had something better: strategic positioning, pockets deep enough to jingle in sonnets, and the sheer audacity of a toddler who declares he owns the sandbox just because he brought 2 shovels. Instead of laboring in the sun to collect sea salt the old-fashioned way, evaporation and hope, Venice imported salt in bulk, mainly from the Croatian coast, and then sold it onward at vastly inflated prices. This was the Venetian salt monopoly, or as I like to call it, the Great Shake and Bake scheme. And it was one of the most lucrative state-run operations of the medieval world, not unlike having a government-sanctioned dessert stand that controls all sugar within 1,000 miles. The Venetian Salt Office, controlled by the state, managed the entire process with the grace of bureaucratic opera: procurement, storage, pricing, distribution. Salt was brought in by galleys, stacked cube-like in warehouses called magazzini, and re-exported to places near and far: Genoa, the Dalmatian coast, the Alps, and even the Papal States. Remarkably, everyone kept buying it, because salt, unlike most government schemes, was actually necessary. To maintain their grip on the trade, Venice used laws, spies, and a fair amount of passive-aggressive diplomacy. They signed exclusive contracts with producers, restricted exports from rival ports, and occasionally blockaded entire regions just to remind them who truly held the seasoning power. Salt control equaled wealth, and wealth, in turn, brought silk, spices, ships, and very well-fed cats. Some say salt even helped fund the Fourth Crusade. You know, the one that got wildly off course and ended with crusaders sacking Christian Constantinople instead of reaching the Holy Land. But let's not dwell too heavily on how a seasoning indirectly led to centuries of Eastern Christian resentment. That sort of thing isn't helpful before bed. Still, the genius of Venice wasn't in simply selling salt. It was how they wrapped it in the velvet cloak of necessity. To many regions without their own salt mines, Venice was the sole provider, the grainy gatekeeper. Their ships cruised not just for business, but as ambassadors of flavor and subtle coercion, ensuring that if you wanted to keep your meat from becoming funkier than a minstrel's tights, you paid the price, or else. Meanwhile, Venetian merchants grew fabulously rich and stylish, while peasants in inland Europe counted themselves lucky if their stew had even a whisper of saltiness left by midwinter. Salt taxes, often imposed by the cities that bought from Venice, became burdensome over time, and resentment stewed quietly like overcooked cabbage. But Venice remained serenely afloat, gazing into its misty lagoons and occasionally inventing new ways to charge extra. Salt prices helped fund their glorious palazzi, patronage of the arts, and increasingly Baroque public festivals that were somewhere between Mardi Gras and a nautical committee meeting. Of course, empires never last forever, and salt monopolies, like well-seasoned stocks, eventually lose their sparkle. But during its heyday, Venice demonstrated a truth as moony as the lights on the canals. With enough boats, bureaucracy, and bureaucrats on boats, you can turn white powder into gold. And so, the lagoon shimmered, salt gathered quietly in sacks, cargo holds creaked beneath moonlight loads, and the Serenissima whispered to the sea, "Trade is art, and art should always come with a markup." Now, as the gentle tides of the Adriatic roll into your imagination, we set our course eastward, to desert roads, camel trains, and ancient mirrors made of salt itself. Chapter 23. The Whispering Vaults of Venice. By now, dear listener, your mind is floating comfortably through the briny mists of history, and tonight we gently drift into the perfume canals of medieval Venice. A place so peculiar and salty, it was practically pickled in mystery. Venice, the floating city, dreamed up by merchants with very little land but a great deal of cunning, was not only a spectacle of soaring domes and sun-dappled gondolas, it was also one of the shrewdest salt empires in Europe. Now picture this. It's the 13th century. The air smells faintly of seaweed, fish stew, and ambition. Across a delicate maze of bridges, merchants conduct deals with the volume and elegance of a choir of caffeinated parrots. And in the heart of it all, tucked into dark stone vaults beneath the grandeur, sits a product so precious it might as well be guarded by sleepy dragons. Salt. You see, Venice understood something long before anyone else did. Salt didn't just flavor food or preserve hams. No, it flavored power and preserved economies. Venetian merchants had mastered the art of bluffing coastal rivals, charming inland lords, and, most importantly, controlling the salt supply routes like elegant pirates in velvet slippers. The salt trade allowed Venice to rise without armies, to conquer without ever storming a hill. Who needs war when you've mastered monopoly? One of Venice's trickiest rivals in their salty courtship with supremacy was Genoa. These two cities, like rival siblings arguing over who spilled the olive oil, competed fiercely across the Mediterranean. But whereas Genoa brought muscle and fast ships, Venice brought auditors, lots of them. In fact, by the 15th century, Venice's salt bureaucracy was a masterpiece. Every grain was counted, taxed, measured, inspected, tucked in a ledger, and occasionally sung to by board officials on night duty. Salt inspectors, known as salinieri, patrolled the marshes like the quiet poetry of paperwork, ensuring no unauthorized grains snuck past their clipboards. And oh, the secret vaults. Underneath the arsenal, that great shipyard of Venetian might. Legend has it that rows of subterranean chambers were used to store not gold, not jewels, but coarse white salt cakes, shimmering faintly like treasure with seasoning. The state even had a department called the Magistrato al Sal, or Magistrates of Salt, which sounds like the opening line of a low-budget medieval superhero film. But these officials were no joke. They dictated where salt could be sold, how much it must cost, and who could lay their hands upon it. Through elaborate taxes and pinch-perfect regulations, the Republic grew incredibly, irrevocably wealthy. Now let us not forget the salt pans, those shallow coastal flats where seawater evaporated under the kiss of the sun, leaving a crunchy harvest of shimmering crystals. Venice sourced their salt not just from nearby marshes, but also from Dalmatian coasts, Sicilian shores, and as far east as the Black Sea. Salt quietly arrived in the bellies of galleys, unloaded onto wooden docks with the hushed reverence of sacred cargo. And if any merchant dared bypass Venetian authority and try to sell unregulated salt, let's just say that the punishment was as salty as the crime. Ships could be confiscated, fines imposed, and in some cases, barrels of illicit salt were ceremoniously dumped into the lagoon, though not, one hopes, near the seafood restaurants. Peace, it turns out, could be wheeled and salted. Venice's dominion over white gold allowed it to maintain wealth and diplomacy in equal measure. Embassies were salted with gifts, and treaties were flavored by barrels. But beyond the politics and clever accounting, there is something deeply poetic about a city floating on water, building its fortune on the alchemy of sea and sun. Venice didn't just sell salt. It told the world, here is a city who sees in salt not merely a spice, but a symphony of sovereignty. And as the night deepens and gondolas bob like lazy fireflies on the mirrored canals, Venice still whispers these ancient truths, that a simple mineral can rule an empire, that commerce can be an art, that softly shuffled ledgers can hum louder than swords. Now rest, traveller. Our journey through history's secret vaults is nearly at its end. In just a little while, we'll arrive at the final grains of knowledge as a last salty breeze carries us gently home. Chapter 24. The Final Grain, when the world finally lost its saltiness. And so, dear listener, we drift gently to the edge of the briny trail we began long ago. Tonight, our tale glimmers like sea foam in moonlight, quiet, old, and oddly comforting. As the sun sets slowly upon the ancient world's long obsession with salt, the flavor of history changed, but not without one final whispering crunch beneath our dreaming toes. Let us ease into the 19th century, a time when top hats were tall, moustaches curled like sleepy cats, and the reign of salt as king of all currencies began to crumble like over-dried crackers. Yes, the once imperial mineral that made empires march and armies mutiny was now just table seasoning. But we mustn't be hasty. Salt hadn't lost its sparkle overnight. It took trains, telegraphs, and quite a few clever chemists to finally knock it from its crystal throne. See, back in the days when every pinch of salt was practically worth its weight in silver, extracting it meant serious labor. Caravans trudged through sandal-dusting deserts. Workers bore brine on their backs. Strong winds swept over pan-boiled salt fields, and people revered the mineral as if it had descended sparkling from some culinary Olympus. Then, along came the Industrial Revolution, puffing and chugging like a teapot with ambitions. With pipes, machines, and the steamy wonders of steamboats, salt could be mined and transported faster and cheaper than ever before. The magical rarity that once built cities and lined the pockets of kings was now riding in third class with everyone else. Don't get me wrong, salt still mattered. It still preserved anchovies and made soups slightly more edible. But where once it had been hoarded tighter than Pharaoh's gold, now it sat in kitchen cupboards near the vinegar. And yet, in its fading glory, salt left whimsical fingerprints all across the globe. In India, for example, in the early 20th century, a quiet man in round spectacles would walk against the empire, barefoot, for salt. Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March in 1930 wasn't just a protest against a tax, it was salt's curtain call as a symbol of defiant dignity. Imagine that, a mineral, once a tax, becoming a flag of revolution. That's salty poetry if ever there was some. Even in America, those white granules still mattered. During the Civil War, Confederate forces guarded their salt works like shin bones in a dog park. The lack of salt literally threatened to rot their food supplies and their dignity. Battles were fought over brine. Yes, people trod muddy fields with muskets, fighting to preserve their pickles. Glory smells faintly of vinegar. And then there were the salt licks, endless geological buffets where wild animals, oblivious to politics, gathered for a taste of sodium. These sites, sacred to animals and inspiring to early humans, slowly became places with names like Buffalo Lick and Licking Creek. Humans, ever poetic about naming things, loved a good descriptive label. What shall we call this town, Jerry? We found a deer licking a rock. That's a lick in town, son. So went the last hurrahs of salt's imperial age, not with an explosion nor a fanfare, but with the whisper of a shaker poured gently into a bowl of stew. By the mid-20th century, salt had become both omnipresent and invisible. Cheap, easy, no longer a treasure trove, until you forgot to put it on your popcorn. And yet, perhaps this is where salt always wanted to be. Not hoarded, not taxed, not marched for or bled over. Just there, quiet, humble, making things taste like themselves, only better. As you rest now, little dream sojourner, consider the salt in your day, the grains on your diner fries, the crystals your grandmother sprinkled on tomatoes, the sea air that left kisses on your skin by the shore. Salt is no longer our currency. It is, instead, our comfort. History is strange like that. What was once priceless becomes ordinary, and in becoming ordinary, becomes beloved. And so we close our tale with one final grain, drifting down like the slow fall of a snowflake, soft, silent, and full of stories. Close your eyes now. The salt caravans have vanished over the dunes. The Roman soldiers have hung up their sandals. The monks have corked their briny barrels. And in your sleep, there's still a faint taste of mystery on your lips. Nighty-night, dear one. Sleep well, and may your dreams be just the right amount of salty.